Last evening on a nationwide broadcast, what started as a typical political discussion evolved into a remarkable instance of insight when Representative Jasmine Crockett presented a compelling case that left Senator J.D. Vance noticeably shaken. The nationally aired event focused on economic policy had been unfolding along expected paths until Crockett revealed a document nobody anticipated she possessed. "Senator Vance," Crockett stated calmly, displaying the paper, "before I address your assertions about public aid programs, I'd like to present a single case from your home state." The host nodded, and the room grew quiet. What followed not only rendered Vance speechless but also prompted the entire audience to burst into spontaneous cheers, violating the event's strict no-reaction policy. Even the host made no effort to regain control as Crockett's case sliced through years of political rhetoric with the sharpness of lived experience and undeniable facts. If you're weary of hearing repetitive arguments about U.S. economic policy, press the like button and subscribe now. Because Jasmine Crockett's flawlessly presented case didn't merely triumph in a debate, it revealed inconsistencies that could reshape how we discuss poverty and opportunity in America for years to come. To grasp why this interaction has garnered over 20 million views in under a day, you need to understand who these two political figures are and the high stakes of their nationally broadcasted clash. Senator J.D. Vance, aged 41, gained prominence through his best-selling book, Hillbilly Elegy, which detailed his journey from a struggling working-class family in Ohio to Yale Law School and eventual prosperity. His personal story of overcoming hardship through effort and resolve became a foundation of his political persona when he successfully campaigned for the Senate. Since assuming office, Vance has positioned himself as a defender of working-class principles while consistently voting to cut public aid programs, contending that such initiatives foster reliance rather than opportunity. In recent months, Vance had grown increasingly vocal about what he termed the shortcomings of government handouts, citing his own life as proof that personal resolve outweighs public support. "I grew up surrounded by poverty," he said in a recent Fox News interview, "and what I observed was that government programs ensnared people in reliance rather than elevating them toward independence." This viewpoint had become a core element of his political messaging and policy stances. Representative Jasmine Crockett brings an entirely different background and perspective to these matters. Now in her second term representing Texas, Crockett built her career as a civil rights lawyer before entering politics. A graduate of the University of Houston Law Center, she gained recognition for her efforts in addressing systemic inequities in the legal system and advocating for marginalized communities. Since joining Congress, Crockett has established herself as one of the most compelling communicators on issues of economic opportunity and social equity. Unlike many lawmakers who rely primarily on ideological claims, Crockett consistently anchors her positions in precise data and real-world stories from her constituents' lives. The National Economic Policy Forum, hosted by a major news network and aired during prime time, was organized to tackle growing concerns about economic disparity and the role of government programs. With recent studies revealing unprecedented wealth gaps in America and ongoing debates about safety net initiatives, the discussion was both timely and critical. What viewers didn't know was that Crockett had arrived exceptionally well prepared for this particular exchange. While other participants relied on standard rhetoric, Crockett had spent weeks collecting detailed data from Vance's home state of Ohio, speaking with residents from his former community, and compiling information that directly countered his narrative about public aid. "I'm not here for ideological debates," she told a staff member before taking the stage. "Tonight is about real people and real results." Sometimes one perfect case can pierce through hours of rhetoric. As the forum entered its second hour, the host shifted to the topic of public aid programs. Vance, speaking with the assurance that came from reiterating his familiar stance, delivered a fervent critique of what he called the handout mentality. "Look, I've seen this firsthand," he said. "Government reliance doesn't elevate people, it holds them back. What truly transforms lives is personal accountability and hard work, not endless government initiatives." It was at this moment that the host turned to Representative Crockett for her response, setting the stage for what would become the evening's defining moment. The studio lights seemed to intensify as the camera zoomed in on Representative Crockett. The audience, which had been relatively calm throughout the evening, sensed a change in atmosphere. "Thank you, host," Crockett began, her voice steady and clear. "Senator Vance, I've listened attentively to your perspective, and I respect your personal journey. But tonight, I'd like to move beyond personal stories to evidence." She turned slightly to face Vance directly. "You frequently referenced your upbringing in Middletown, Ohio, as proof that public aid fosters reliance rather than opportunity. But I've spent time examining the actual data from your hometown, and I'd like to share one case that might challenge that narrative." Vance nodded confidently, seemingly unperturbed. This was familiar ground for him. He had built his career on this narrative. Crockett opened a folder on the desk before her. In 1992, when you were about 8 years old, Middletown introduced an expanded child nutrition program that provided free school meals to all children, regardless of income, removing the stigma and application barriers that prevented many eligible families from participating, she said, looking up at Vance. This program was funded by the very type of public aid you now regularly oppose. The audience grew noticeably quieter. Vance shifted slightly in his seat as Crockett continued. I've also obtained educational outcome data for Middletown during this period, she said, placing a document on the table between them. In the 5 years after this expanded program was introduced, high school graduation rates rose by 18%. College enrollment increased by 22%. These aren't my figures, they're from Ohio's official education records. She turned to a new page. But here's the case I really want to highlight. I recently spoke with Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins, who was a lunch supervisor at your elementary school during those years. At the mention of this name, Vance's expression changed subtly, a flicker of recognition. Mrs. Jenkins, who still lives in Middletown at age 78, remembers you well, Crockett continued. She shared something remarkable. She said that before the expanded program, many children would skip lunch rather than use meal vouchers that marked them as receiving aid. After the program eliminated that stigma, attendance and afternoon academic performance measurably improved. Crockett looked directly at Vance. Mrs. Jenkins specifically remembered you, Senator. She recalled how you went from occasionally skipping meals to becoming a regular in the lunch line once all children were treated equally. She even kept records of which students showed academic improvements after the program began, and your name was on that list. The studio was utterly silent now. Vance's usual confident demeanor had visibly wavered. But here's what makes this one case so powerful, Crockett continued. Last month, you voted against the School Nutrition Enhancement Act, which would have provided similar universal meal programs to schools across America. You called it unnecessary government overreach that fosters reliance. She paused, letting the contradiction sink in. Senator Vance, the same program you benefited from, which by all objective measures improved outcomes in your community, is the very type of aid you now vote to deny other children. Crockett wasn't attacking Vance personally. Her tone remained respectful and measured, but the precision of her case had cut through years of political rhetoric to expose a fundamental inconsistency. My question is straightforward, she said. How do you reconcile your votes against nutrition aid with the documented benefits such programs had in your own community, benefits that, according to Mrs. Jenkins and the data I've gathered, helped create the very opportunities that contributed to your own success? The host, recognizing the weight of the moment, allowed the question to linger without interruption. Vance, who had built his political career on quick retorts and confident assertions, opened his mouth to respond but then paused for several seconds, an eternity on television. He seemed genuinely at a loss for words. When he finally spoke, his usual certainty was noticeably absent. Well, the circumstances were different then. Today's programs aren't structured the same way, and the fiscal realities, I'm sorry to interrupt, Crockett said politely, but the bill you voted against last month was modeled directly on the Middletown program. It was designed with the same universal access principles that eliminated stigma in your community. The legislative text explicitly references Middletown as a success story. She held up the bill text with highlighted sections. Page 17, Section 3 specifically cites the Middletown model as its framework. The programs are structurally identical. The camera captured Vance's expression as the contradiction became undeniable. This wasn't a broad political argument, it was a specific, documented case that directly challenged the consistency of his position. I would need to review the specific provisions, Vance said, his usual confident cadence replaced with hesitation. There are always complexities in legislation that don't translate to real-world implementation. The bill is only 24 pages, Crockett responded, handing a copy to the host. I'm happy to provide it for your review, but my point isn't about political gotchas. It's about consistency and evidence-based policy. She turned slightly to address the broader audience. When we discuss public aid, we're not talking about abstract ideas. We're talking about real programs that affect real lives. The evidence from Middletown shows that thoughtfully designed nutrition aid didn't create reliance, it created opportunity. The data supports it. The educators confirm it. And frankly, Senator, your own life story demonstrates it, even if that doesn't fit neatly into today's political narratives. What happened next transformed an already powerful exchange into a truly historic television moment. The host, recognizing the substantive nature of the confrontation, asked a follow-up question. Senator Vance, would you like to respond to the specific case Representative Crockett has raised? Vance, gathering himself, attempted to pivot. Look, We can cherry-pick examples all day long. The broader point is that fostering a culture of government reliance— I'm sorry, Senator, the host interrupted, showing unusual persistence, but the representative has provided specific data about a program in your hometown that appears to contradict your position. Could you address that specific case? This follow-up was unexpected. Hosts typically allow politicians to pivot to talking points without pressing for direct answers. The audience seemed to collectively lean forward. Vance paused, visibly reassessing his approach. I appreciate the representative's research into Middletown's history. There were certainly some effective programs during that period. But my concern is with the broader culture of— Senator, Crockett interjected respectfully but firmly, this isn't about broad cultural arguments. This is about specific policy. You've repeatedly cited your personal experience as evidence that public aid doesn't work. Yet, when presented with documented evidence that such aid benefited your own community, and, by Mrs. Jenkins' account, you haven't addressed the contradiction. She continued, if the Middletown program worked, and the data strongly suggests it did, why vote against implementing similar programs nationally? This isn't about politics or ideology. It's about what actually helps children succeed. The studio audience, which had been instructed to remain silent during exchanges, spontaneously erupted into applause. The host made a brief attempt to restore order, then relented as the applause continued for nearly 30 seconds. When the room finally quieted, Vance's expression had changed. Something in his demeanor shifted, and what happened next surprised everyone. You know what, he said, his tone noticeably different. You've clearly done your homework, Representative, and you're right that the Middletown program had positive outcomes. I haven't connected those dots to my recent votes, and that's a fair challenge. The audience fell completely silent, unaccustomed to hearing a politician acknowledge a contradictory position so directly. Mrs. Jenkins, Vance continued with what appeared to be genuine emotion, was indeed a presence in my early school years. I haven't thought about those lunch programs in years, but they were important. He paused, seeming to wrestle with memories. There were days when that school lunch was the most reliable meal I'd get. And you're right, when they changed to the universal program, it removed the stigma. I remember before that change, some kids would skip lunch entirely rather than use the colored tickets that marked them as poor. This candid acknowledgement created a palpable shift in the studio. Several audience members nodded in recognition, many having experienced similar programs or having children who benefited from them. Crockett nodded respectfully, recognizing the significance of this moment. She hadn't set out to embarrass Vance but to establish a factual basis for policy discussion. Thank you, Senator, she said. My point isn't that every government program works perfectly or that personal responsibility isn't important. It's that evidence, not ideology, should guide our decisions about which programs to support. The Middletown data shows that well-designed aid can create pathways to the very self-sufficiency we all want to see. The host, recognizing the unusual substance of this exchange, allowed it to continue past the normal time limits. Representative, you mentioned you spoke with residents from Middletown. Did you learn anything else relevant to this discussion? Yes, Crockett replied, pulling out another document. I spoke with Dr. Robert Putnam, who studied Middletown extensively for his research on social capital. He found that the Universal Meal Program didn't just improve nutrition, it strengthened community bonds by removing divisions between children. Teachers reported better classroom cohesion. These soft outcomes created a better learning environment for everyone. She displayed a graph showing attendance rates before and after the program's implementation. The data shows that chronic absenteeism dropped 23% in the 2 years after the program began. Teacher surveys indicated that afternoon behavioral problems decreased by almost a third. These aren't just numbers. They represent real children who were better able to learn because a basic need was met without shame or stigma. She turned again to Vance. Senator, your book eloquently described how community breakdown affected opportunities in your hometown. The data suggests these universal programs actually helped rebuild some of that community cohesion during your school years. The very social capital you've written about was strengthened by thoughtful government intervention. Vance leaned forward, now genuinely engaged rather than defensive. The program did remove certain barriers, he acknowledged. I remember there was less distinction between kids after that change. Exactly, Crockett responded. And that's precisely what the current legislation you voted against last month aims to do: remove barriers and stigma while ensuring children can focus on learning rather than hunger. The data from Middletown shows this approach works. She displayed side-by-side images of the original Middletown program documentation and the recent bill. The key provisions are remarkably similar. Universal eligibility to eliminate stigma, nutrition standards based on the same research, even the implementation timeline. The only substantial difference is scale. Something remarkable was happening on live television. What had begun as a standard political confrontation had transformed into a substantive, evidence-based discussion about policy effectiveness. Viewers across the political spectrum were witnessing something rarely seen in modern politics, a genuine exchange that moved beyond talking points to grapple with real evidence. An older gentleman in the front row of the audience, identified earlier as a retired school principal, stood up despite the forum rules. "I implemented a similar program in my district in Pennsylvania," he said. "The representative is right, these programs work. We saw the same results with attendance and performance." The host, rather than cutting him off, simply nodded and allowed this unexpected testimony. 3 other audience members stood to briefly share similar experiences from their communities: a school nurse, a current teacher, and a parent volunteer. Each verification added weight to Crockett's case. As their segment of the forum concluded, the camera panned across the audience, capturing faces that reflected not the usual partisan reactions but something more thoughtful. This wasn't about who won a political exchange, it was about a moment of clarity that transcended typical political divisions. The forum's host, an experienced journalist known for maintaining strict neutrality, seemed moved by the unexpected turn of events. "In my 20 years moderating political discussions," she said, "I'm not sure I've witnessed an exchange with this level of substantive impact. We've moved beyond talking points to something more meaningful." She turned to both participants. "Before we take our break, would either of you like to add any final thoughts on this topic?" Vance spoke first. "I appreciate the representative bringing this specific case forward. While I still have concerns about how public aid is structured in many contexts, I think this conversation has highlighted the importance of looking at specific outcomes rather than broad generalizations, including my own. That's something I'll take back to my policy team." Crockett nodded. "Thank you, Senator. I believe this is how governance should work, examining evidence, acknowledging what programs actually do in people's lives, and being willing to reassess our positions when presented with new information. That's not weakness, it's how we get to better policy." As the program went to commercial, the studio audience, comprising people from across the political spectrum, rose and sustained applause. It wasn't partisan approval, it was recognition of a rare moment of authentic engagement with evidence rather than ideology. Several audience members could be seen wiping away tears, moved by the unexpected breakthrough in an era of relentless political division. The aftermath of the Crockett-Vance exchange was immediate and far-reaching. Within hours, clips of the confrontation had spread across every social media platform. #Middletown Example and #Crockett Receipts began trending nationwide, with the exchange generating over 40 million views in just 24 hours. What distinguished this viral moment from typical political clips was its substantive impact. Major news outlets didn't just report on the personal dynamics of the exchange, they began investigating the Middletown program Crockett had referenced, confirming her data and expanding on the story. The Columbus Dispatch published an in-depth feature titled "The Middletown Miracle," revisiting the school program that changed a community. Reporters interviewed dozens of former students and educators, including Mrs. Jenkins, who confirmed her conversations with Representative Crockett and expanded on her recollections of the program's impact. "For years, I watched children go hungry because they were too proud to use those colored lunch tickets that marked them as poor kids," Jenkins told the Dispatch. "When the universal program started, everything changed. Attendance improved. Afternoon focus improved. Children from different backgrounds sat together. It wasn't just about food, it was about dignity." Education policy experts weighed in across publications and television programs, most confirming that Crockett's characterization of the program's outcomes aligned with research findings. "What makes the Middletown case so compelling," said education researcher Linda Darling-Hammond on CNN, "is that we have long-term outcome data that shows the sustained impact of this intervention. This isn't theoretical, it's documented." Perhaps most surprisingly, the exchange generated thoughtful reflection across the political spectrum. Conservative columnist David Brooks wrote, "Whatever one's politics, Representative Crockett's approach deserves respect. Instead of abstract arguments, she brought specific evidence about a specific program with measurable outcomes. This is how policy debates should function." For Senator Vance, the exchange represented both a challenge and an opportunity. Initially, his office released a statement emphasizing his continuing belief in personal responsibility as the primary path to success. But 3 days after the forum, Vance did something few politicians do. He published a more reflective response in the Wall Street Journal. "While I maintain my concerns about government reliance," he wrote, "Representative Crockett raised fair questions about consistency that deserve thoughtful engagement rather than defensive dismissal. The Middletown program she referenced did indeed produce positive outcomes, and I've asked my staff to review similar initiatives to identify what made that program successful where others have failed." Political analysts noted this nuanced response as potentially significant. "Vance isn't abandoning his core position," said political scientist Norman Ornstein. but he's acknowledging that evidence matters in today's political environment. That's remarkably refreshing. For Representative Crockett, the forum elevated her national profile from rising political star to substantive policy voice. Universities and policy institutes invited her to speak about evidence-based approaches to economic mobility. Her office reported receiving thousands of messages from citizens across the political spectrum, expressing appreciation for her focus on facts rather than ideology. What Representative Crockett demonstrated wasn't partisan politics, wrote the editorial board of The Washington Post. It was the all-too-rare art of evidence-based policy analysis. By focusing on a specific program with documented outcomes, and one with personal relevance to her debate opponent, she changed the nature of the conversation from ideological assertion to factual evaluation. Perhaps most significantly, the exchange changed how some media outlets approached subsequent policy discussions. Several major networks announced they would be implementing a Middletown standard for political forums, requiring participants to provide specific examples and evidence for their claims rather than relying solely on broad ideological statements. 2 weeks after the forum, a surprising development occurred when Senator Vance visited Middletown, Ohio, his first return to his hometown in several years. Local media reported that he met with Mrs. Jenkins and other former educators to discuss the school nutrition program in detail. While no cameras were allowed in these meetings, participants described them as genuinely inquisitive rather than politically motivated. Following this visit, Vance made news by co-sponsoring an amendment to a pending education bill that would fund a pilot program replicating elements of the original Middletown model in 50 school districts nationwide. While emphasizing that his broader concerns about government reliance remained, he acknowledged that some programs, when properly designed to preserve dignity and create opportunity, can make a meaningful difference. This unexpected legislative move received bipartisan support, with Representative Crockett joining as a Democratic co-sponsor. "This isn't about political victories," she said when announcing her support. "It's about effective policy based on evidence rather than ideology." I welcome Senator Vance's willingness to engage with the data, regardless of our other political differences. 6 months later, when the pilot program passed as part of the larger education bill, political commentators pointed to the Crockett-Vance exchange as a catalyst for what The Atlantic called a small but significant outbreak of evidence-based governance. For ordinary Americans watching this story unfold, the exchange represented something increasingly rare in political discourse, a moment when specific facts and documented outcomes took precedence over partisan talking points. The forum didn't resolve all political differences between Crockett and Vance, but it demonstrated that substantive engagement with evidence could sometimes transcend the usual political divides. As one Middletown resident told reporters during Vance's visit, "I don't care which party comes up with good ideas. I care about what actually works." We need more of these conversations based on real results instead of just fighting all the time. 1 year after the exchange, when researchers at Stanford published a comprehensive study of universal school meal programs, their findings confirmed what Crockett had highlighted. Such programs, when implemented without stigma, consistently improved educational outcomes and, contrary to creating reliance, often led to increased economic mobility. The study specifically cited the Crockett-Vance exchange as having reintroduced evidence into a policy debate that had become primarily ideological, demonstrating how specific, documented examples can sometimes bridge partisan divides when broader arguments cannot. For Representative Crockett, perhaps the most meaningful outcome came in the form of a handwritten note from a young girl in East Texas. "I watched you talk about school lunches with Senator Vance. I get free lunch at my school. Thank you for making me feel like it's okay." If this story inspired you to value facts and evidence in political discussions, please press the like button and subscribe to our channel for more content that goes beyond the usual political noise to find meaningful substance. Share in the comments your thoughts about the power of specific examples to change minds when general arguments fail. Have you ever seen someone's perspective shift when presented with concrete evidence rather than opinions? Your experiences help build our community of viewers who value substance over sound bites.